Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this keynote webinar for Alana's first ever winter exhibition, Chasing Icebergs. It's my honor and pleasure to welcome Eleanor to give tonight's talk. Eleanor Jones Harvey is Senior Curator at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. She earned a BA with distinction in art history from the University of Virginia and a Ph.D. in the history of art from Yale University. She organized the widely praised exhibition, The Civil War in American Art, at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and at the Metropolitan Museum of Art from 2012 to 2013. And her most recent exhibition was Alexander von Humboldt and the United States, Art, Nature, and Culture at the Smithsonian American Art Museum from 2020 to 2021. From 1992 to 2002, she was the Curator of American Art at the Dallas Museum of Art, where she organized the exhibition, The Voyage of the Icebergs, Frederic Church's Arctic Masterpiece in 2002, to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the gift of the painting to the museum. And now to lead us on this voyage of Frederic Church's Icebergs, please join me in welcoming Eleanor.
Good evening, everyone. It is a distinct pleasure to be here tonight to help celebrate the inauguration of this wonderful exhibition, Chasing Icebergs, at the historic site. What I'd like to do is start you off in an intrepid quest in 4 parts: the disappearance and reappearance of the painting, and the saving of Alana as kind of the backdrop for what we're going to do tonight. I'd like to start, however, with the painting itself. Frederic Church's The Icebergs, painted in 1861, oil on canvas, as you can see, close to 6 feet by 10 feet when you add its substantial frame. And it's a painting that was the gift of Norma and Lamar Hunt in the fall of 1979. But before we actually get to the painting, there's first the quest. It's Church's quest for knowledge, the quest for direct observation, and the quest for accumulated data that is going to allow him to paint a work directly from nature. Here is our friend the icebergs, all 6 foot by 9 feet of it. That is the centerpiece of this exhibition and the prompt for the exhibition at Alana, Chasing Icebergs. But before we get to the painting, there is the quest to get there. And what you see here is a montage of the 2 books, After Icebergs with a Painter, published right as the Icebergs painting was debuting in New York in 1861, and the brand new updated version of this wonderful tome, edited by Will Coleman, and who is along with Allegra Davis, are the curators of the Chasing Icebergs exhibition, which chronicles Church's voyage around Labrador and Newfoundland in order to amass the sketches that would allow him to paint this massive artwork. So it's a quest in 4 parts, and this first part really has to do with accumulating knowledge, derived from direct observation and the accumulation of data. It's the summer of 1859. Louis Le Grand Noble describes Church's trip to the Arctic as a time when he was once again discoverer, pioneer, and conqueror. It's a carefully calibrated exercise in marketing, as deftly crafted as the painting itself, and it was a way of initially marketing what Church was presenting to the public. Church and Noble took the schooner Integrity up into the Arctic waters, and there they caught their first glimpse of an iceberg. And you can see in this particular small oil sketch, there is the berg off in the distance. There is the tiny rowboat that they are using in order to go get it. And one of the things Church is going to have to grapple with in all of his sketches and in his paintings is the issue of scale. As he gets closer to the icebergs get bigger and they begin to fill the sequence. The seas are also kind of rough, and this is in particular a thing that Church ends up having to grapple with because he has a tendency to get seasick. And in fact, Louis Le Grand Noble, when he talks about Church's fortitude and intrepidous behavior, will actually quote himself and say, if one is curious about the troubles of painting on a little coaster, lightly ballasted, dashing forward, frequently under press of sail with a short sea, I would recommend to him a good stout swing. While in the enjoyment of his smooth and sickening vibrations, let him spread his palette, arrange his canvas, and paint a pair of colts at their gambols in some adjacent field. In other words, everything is in motion. The sea is in motion, the icebergs are bobbing, displacing water, the boat is going back and forth. And in this wonderful sketch at the bottom here, I noticed that Church had painted a turbulent sea and a boat in a storm. And of course, I know that he had gotten seasick in Labrador, but this is not a sketch from the Arctic. This is actually a sketch from a later trip to the Middle East. And knowing that the camel is known as the ship of the desert, I wondered if Church experienced some queasiness while on his camel ride from Beirut to Petra in 1868. So what did Church accomplish? In spite of all of this, Church used his acute vision and his understanding of ice in order to give us a number of really amazing oil sketches, some of which are in this exhibition. You'll notice in this one, I'm combining these with contemporary photographs. Look at the way that he's captured the veining of the blues and the greens in the middle of the iceberg from the compressed ice. If you take a look at the way that Church is able to figure out the characteristic shapes sculpted by wind and water, for the individual ice flows, he's also able to capture that liminal light during the time of the midnight sun when it never really gets dark. Because of course, Church is up there in the middle of the summer months, but that notion of being able to catch all of those colors. And perhaps one of my favorites, a sketch that he simply titles Midnight Labrador, which gives you these wonderful deep Prussian blue tones against the colors of the sky. So all the while that Church is up here, he is grappling with scale. If you'll notice on his sketch, he's inscribed it iceberg, enormous size, 3.5 miles distant, strange resemblance to a house. The idea of scale, particularly if you take a look at this photograph in the foreground, is you have to come to grips with the fact that these things look small because of the sketches, but in fact can be utterly gigantic. Church also paid attention to the way wind and water sculpted the ice into what looked like the frozen form of hoodoos with ice caves. And if you look at Church's drawing on the left and this photograph on the right, you begin to see how he has done that. Notice in the sketch too that there's a tiny boat in the back, again, giving you that sense of scale that Church is trying to absorb at the same time. In this particular sketch, one of the things that he's really trying to get out of all three vignettes is that wonderful lurid green color that is reflected up from the ocean. And if you look at the painting in the lower right-hand corner, this is a painting which also shows you that same kind of lime green. But what's important to remember about this is not just the fact that Church is leaning on that kind of scientific information and direct observation. The sketch was done in the summer of 1859. The painting down in the bottom is 1891. So Church is drawing on these materials over the course of his career, making sure that he now has this deck of information that he can use. So it's a realism here that's in conscious contrast to what Church will do when he is actually starting to script the icebergs. If you notice, he will shift from that kind of ultra-realistic floating iceberg and instead begin to kind of create what I think of as an ice landscape. So maybe it's in response to getting seasick that in his major painting, he actually makes it look like you have a stable foreground and a shallow sea, and that you can actually walk from spot to spot in this particular painting without ending up having a dousing in ultra cold water. But what's really interesting here is that he really takes away the mobility of the iceberg in order to give you what is, in effect, an ice skate. Which brings us to that major painting and the press surrounding it. What I'd like to do is remind you that this is a painting that was displayed under gaslights with curtains and carpet, a pre-IMAX experience, if you will, for your ancestors who would have paid 25 cents then, now up close to $6, for the privilege of standing in front of this painting and sort of marveling at its virtuosity. The preliminary advertisement for all of this referred to the painting as the Icebergs. But Church had the singular misfortune to end up debuting this painting 12 days after the shots fired at Fort Sumter started the American Civil War. And as a result, in a fit of patriotism, he changes the title to The North, Church's picture of the icebergs. And if you'll notice underneath that, exhibited for the benefit of the Patriotic Fund. So all of those proceeds are going to go toward the Union Patriotic Fund to help take care of widows and orphans in the event of a soldier's death. I'd like to also draw your attention to the lower foreground because I've deliberately chosen to show you a version of this painting, thanks to Photoshop, in which there is no broken mast in the lower left-hand corner. We know that this painting started out with absolutely no reference to human beings, no need to actually indicate the scale of all of this. And in fact, one of the reviewers said, there is no trace whatsoever of human association, not a living creature of any description, no ship, no boat, not even the semblance of a wreck, no connecting link of any sort between them and the canvas. One brown boulder of rock lodged on the ice alone hints that the great floating glacier was once in contact with the earth. So we need to take kind of a close look at this, because if we move forward, then what we will see is the mast in the foreground, which is the way the painting appears to us today. Frederic Church's painting, The North, does not find a buyer. Not really surprising. When war breaks out, the economy tends to skid to a halt. And the painting basically sat in Church's studio, kind of like an iceberg, for over a year. He needs it to move. He's got other ideas for other paintings. And this one is kind of a reminder that the marketing didn't quite work. But he has a dealer in the UK, James McClure, who arranges to bring the painting to London in 1863. But let's remember two things about 1863. First of all, if Church is going to sell this painting in England, England is drifting towards supporting the Confederacy, which means a painting that is designed to extol the North over the South might not go over very well. And so Church will not only paint the mast in the foreground as a nod to the search for Sir John Franklin, but he will shift the title back to the icebergs, describing it as painted from studies made in the northern seas in the summer of 1859, in order to link to this to Arctic exploration and Arctic rescue. As a marketing technique, this one turned out to be successful. When this debuted in the German gallery on Bond Street, every living polar explorer, plus Lady Jane Franklin, came to see it. It was celebrated as a kind of homage to the British spirit in terms of trying to find the lost Franklin expedition. And it was purchased by a patriotic member of Parliament, Edward Watkins, who then allowed Church to make a chromolithograph of this, a color print from the 19th century that could be sold on subscription as well. So let's pause a moment to ponder at the issue of scale, because the early oil sketch for the icebergs shows the entire 91-foot-long whaling vessel there beached on the ice in the upper right-hand corner. And down in the left, I just show you one of the many engravings that deal with the quest for Arctic exploration, again, showing an intact entire vessel crushed between the ice with these gigantic ice flows. In a second compositional study, the one that Church, where he's starting to sketch out the actual contours of the icebergs, you'll notice that the entire wrecked ship is still there. So the massive iceberg behind, that one with the dome on it, is potentially 30 to 50 stories tall. We are talking about something that is utterly gigantic if it can basically enfold a 91-foot-long ship without breaking scale. So with the mast, the way that Church ends up putting it in the foreground completely resets the scale of the picture. Instead of the ship on top of the ice cave, we now have that glacial erratic circled in blue in the actual painting. And then, as if pointing to it, the spar of the mast with the crow's nest, probably the upper 15 feet of the entire ship's mast instead. If you think about that being 15 feet tall in the foreground rather than 91 feet long, the entire internal scale of the painting shifts. But Church isn't really concerned with that, because for Church, the change in scale is really not so much about how big is the iceberg. It's really about the poignancy of loss and about how to make a personal statement, a personal fragment, as a powerful symbol of the missing whole. So if we look down in the lower left-hand corner, right next to the mast, there is a bluish promontory of ice that actually has Church's signature on it. And you'll notice that's the one in the lower left-hand corner there. You can just make out Church's signature on that bit of blue. But again, look at the same shelf of ice, the way Church had initially envisioned it. Originally, again, a large enough piece of ice to accommodate the carcass of an entire whaling ship rather than simply the uppermost part of the mast. The mast has been compared to a cross, the entire painting to an icy graveyard, the whole notion of, again, poignantly mourning the loss of so many lives up in the Arctic from Sir John Franklin forward and backward. It's interesting that no critic actually remarked on this because the painting is no longer really about science. It's about the human condition. It's Church, the pioneer and the explorer, now meditating on the cost associated with those expeditions. And this is the painting that Sir William Watkin purchased. So who is Sir William Watkin? Well, he's an MP, and this is the home, Rose Hill, that he took it to in Manchester, England. And in his portrait here, I'd like you to pay attention to the fact that in the window behind him, there is a viaduct with a train on it. Watkin is not an art collector as such. He's not directly involved with Arctic exploration, but he's deeply vested in North America. And in fact, he is a railroad guy. He is the owner of the Grand Trunk Railway Company of Canada, what will become the Canadian Pacific. And what you will find here is that the map down below, the modern map of the Dominion of Canada, shows you the network of Grand Trunk Pacific Railway lines in which Watkin was an investor. The punch cartoon of Sir Watkin figuring out what's the next rail line he will end up taking over plays into the fact that he is definitely known as the railway king in England. He also played an interesting role in the Dominion of Canada. In 1861, he ended up in the United States, and by 1867, the notion of confederation, in which the Canadian provinces are united as the Dominion of Canada, took place in part with his involvement. For that, he received a knighthood in 1868 and was made a baronet in 1880. The year after he purchased the Icebergs, he traveled to the United States with a group of British entrepreneurs looking for an ambitious expansion of American railroads. So he's deeply involved, not just in British, but also in Canadian and by extension in American railroad politics. So this is a painting that ends up being a part of his home. He was also interested, by the way, just as a non sequitur, in building a channel tunnel from Calais to Dover. So probably 100 years before it really happens, you actually have a man who is envisioning having this at once. It is on that transatlantic crossing that Watkin makes in 1861. He saw icebergs on the way over and made marks of them in his journal. So it was something that he clearly paid attention to. But what's interesting to me is that this is a man who celebrated the success of the Canadian Transcontinental Railroad, and in doing so, put it in this perspective. The problem of a Northwest Passage has been solved in a new and better way. It's no longer a question of threading dusk and dismal seas within the limits of Arctic ice and snow, doubtful to find and impossible, if found, to navigate. In other words, what Watkin was celebrating in the purchase of this painting is that it's no longer necessary to risk life and limb in the Arctic North in order to try to find a navigable passageway from the East Coast to the West Coast of the North American continent. You can now safely do that thanks to his railroads, thanks to his help with the Dominion of Canada, linking all of the provinces. And this is, in a way, a trophy of an earlier time period, a way of saying we don't need to do it this way anymore. And I think that in that regard, where the railroad replaces ships stuck in the ice, it must have been a really satisfying thing for him to have under his roof. So this is the next part of our quest, because the Icebergs functionally disappears for pretty much close to 100 years. And the real question is, how do you lose a painting of this scale when it really doesn't ever leave the house? Frederic Church dies in 1900, his career by then eclipsed by the rise of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. Watkin dies a year later in 1901. The house, Rose Hill, is remanded to the city of Manchester in lieu of taxes, and it serves a variety of purposes over the next century. It starts out as a home for unwed mothers. It becomes an ophthalmic hospital, a convalescent home, an orphanage, and in the 1970s, it was a residential center for delinquent boys. So during the course of that century, the painting gradually moved from the art gallery of pictures to an upstairs hallway, this one specifically, therefore hiding in plain sight. As Church's reputation dimmed, nobody was really looking for this painting. A painting listed as F.E. Church 1861, not by an artist anyone in England recognized, wouldn't attract a whole lot of attention. And once it's up at the top of that stairs, it's probably not coming back down again anytime soon. Until a young scholar named David Huntington wrote his dissertation at Yale on a previously obscure artist named Frederic Church. In 1960, when he arrived at Yale, his advisor knew that he was interested in American art, which was terribly out of fashion at the time, and said, "Why don't you write on this Frederic Church person? He seems to have been really important in his day, but we don't seem to know much about him anymore." And that set David Huntington on the path that would take him to doing research at Olana, and to create the first major exhibition of Church's work since his memorial exhibition. This one, for which this book was done, The Landscapes of Frederick Edwin Church, published in 1966, was an exhibition, in fact, at my museum, now the Smithsonian American Art Museum. So the cover is not the painting The Icebergs, because the icebergs had been lost. But if you remember, there's a chromolithograph, that color reproduction that was done in 1864 and sold by subscription. And Huntington put it on the cover of his book. Not Niagara, not Heart of the Andes, not any of the other major works that we all know and love by Church, but he put a work of art that we didn't really know existed any longer on the cover. But he was convinced that if he put it on the cover, that somewhere someone would recognize it. And he described it to me when I met him as a long shot, just like putting your missing child's picture on a milk carton in hopes that somebody somewhere would recognize it, and that there would be a happy reunion. So that brings us to 1978. Mayor and Glenn Balch are the superintendent and wife at Rose Hill School for Delinquent Boys. They were looking for money in order to buy a derelict cottage in the Lake District in order to give those kids some honest hard work out under the open air. And she figured by her accounts that it would take about 14,000 pounds in 1978 coinage to buy that cottage and set it up as a work project. So she's looking around the house for anything that she can sell that might actually get them the money. And she hauls this picture down from the upper stairwell that you see there, took a series of Polaroids, and sent them off to Sotheby's in London. Well, as I mentioned, Church is not an American artist. It is the 1970s, and the British are not particularly interested in American art, but there is a gentleman at Sotheby's there named James Miller who got tagged with all of these stray American pictures. And it's another story entirely. There is an entire generation's worth of American landscape painters who left work in England intentionally while they were there that has not yet popped up for anyone who wants to go on a similar quest. So James Miller gets this image, and he swears he's seen this somewhere before. And he pulls out David Huntington's book and realizes that what he is looking at is the long lost icebergs. David Huntington's gamble paid off. So James Miller recalls, and I spoke to him in putting together my exhibition, that when he dropped the Polaroid into the interoffice mail to head to the New York office of Sotheby's, it was with the droll note, presumably this should come to you for sale. My understanding is that the New York office broke out in screams when they opened up the packet and realized what James Miller was looking at. The news, it didn't take long to hit the press. The New York Times and Metropolitan report, 2 Britons find US artists' long lost icebergs. And the painting was going on its way to the United States. This is a photograph that Jerry Carr took of the icebergs in the preview for the sale. You will notice that it is heavy enough that it is resting on blocks rather than hanging on the wall, but it also gives you, again, a sense of relative scale for that and the rest of the paintings that were in this particular sale. On October 25th, 1979, John Marion, the legendary auctioneer for Sotheby's, took the podium. The sales room, as you can see, was packed. This is before the internet. This is before cell phones. The buyers had paddles in the room, and there were several of them on the phones, each one talking to an individual representative from Sotheby's. The bidding was intense, but it was also slow and in very small increments, unlike the fast pace that we experience now. It finally came down to 2 bidders on the telephone, bidding at $50,000 increments as this painting inches up to break the record paid for an American artwork when it hit $1 million, inching its way up to $2 million. And after 3 minutes and 45 seconds, it hammered down at $2.5 million, not just breaking, but shattering the previous record. The speculation was rampant as to who might have bought at this, who was actually willing to pay this amount of money. And in fact, it was not long after this that the painting shows up in Dallas, Texas, first as a long-term loan and then as an outright anonymous gift to the Dallas Museum of Art. It became the centerpiece of the DMA collection, created a tremendous buzz there. And in 1992, when I arrived at the Dallas Museum of Art, this was not just the centerpiece of the exhibition, but when I read the file, I understood that the terms of the gift were that the donors were to remain anonymous and that no one associated with the DMA was to confirm, deny, or speculate as to the identity of the donor. So Huntington's gamble helped bring the icebergs back into the art world. Dallas asked Gerald Carr, who was teaching at Southern Methodist University, if he would conduct the research and write an accompanying book that reintroduced the painting to the art world and the world at large. It was then, and it still is today, an outstanding primary resource in scholarship and a model for the rest of us who subsequently entered the field of American art. And it certainly has shaped Jerry's career and his own interest in Frederic Church. David Huntington contributed the introduction to that, a nice nod between the two of them, which I think was really wonderful. And then 25 years later, when I was asked to do a celebratory show for the 25th anniversary of the gift, I asked Jerry if he would contribute an essay to this volume. And that handoff, I think, is really the most important. So in this book, I will tell you all of the nitty-gritty about the people I spoke to, the underbidders, the thrill of the chase. There were several people who got very close to finding the icebergs before Mayor Balch brought it down that staircase. There were other people competing to buy the painting before it ended up in Sotheby's hands. And the story of how it got to the DMA is all in there. But I couldn't get the donors to be willing to identify themselves. They weren't quite ready at that point. And so I came up with at least 6 euphemisms for the anonymous donors of the painting and told Lamar and Norma that it would have been a whole lot easier if I had actually been able to call them by name. Although I was embargoed from confirming, denying, or speculating as to the identity of the owners, it was potentially the worst kept secret in Dallas. And in fact, 6 months after the donation of the painting, Michael Ennis wrote this wonderful story in Texas Monthly. Would you pay $2.5 million for that painting? Lots of people think that Lamar Hunt did, but he's not telling, and 9/10 of the true story of the icebergs is still below the surface. Over the years, I got to know Lamar and Norma, and gradually was able to tease out the story of how they ended up bringing the icebergs from New York to Dallas and into the Dallas Museum of Art. And in fact, it was 6 months after his death in 2006 that the family met and decided that it was time to put his name and Norma's on this major gift that electrified the art world and transformed the Dallas Museum of Art. Lamar is best known as one of the founders of first the American Football League and what we now know as the NFL. He coined the term Super Bowl. He was a minority owner of the Chicago Bulls. He moved his Dallas team to Kansas City, which was the Kansas City Chiefs. And he loved sports. But what he also loved was the thrill of the chase. And in bringing the icebergs to Dallas, there were a number of stories that he tried to get it into the house and the door wasn't big enough, so he had to give it to the museum. The truth could not be further from that. As Lamar said, he knew exactly where that painting needed to go, and he bought it specifically with the Dallas Museum of Art in mind. It is to this day, I think, the single greatest philanthropic gift that the DMA has received. So Huntington's book on Church played a pivotal role in Jerry's book and in my book on the Voyage of the Icebergs, but it's also played a pivotal role in the 20th century trajectory of Church's career and reputation. Huntington's book also played a role in saving Church's magnificent home on the Hudson, and today Olana is a treasure of the Hudson River Valley, a magnet for art lovers, and the organizer for the exhibition Chasing Icebergs, which will open up this week. But in 1964, its very existence was in jeopardy. It was David Huntington who helped spearhead the campaign to save the house. His book came out shortly after Nelson Rockefeller signed the legislation that preserved the house and the surrounding acreage that we know as the Olana Partnership today. And so we have another leg of the quest, from the hunt to the icebergs, to the preservation of Olana, to the current exhibit that brings us full circle. That idea that David Huntington's placement of that chromolithograph on the cover of his book sort of helped accelerate the move of the icebergs back into the public view, that his advocacy for Olana and for Frederic Church helped save the house, and that those confluences, that trajectory now allows us to come full circle and bring an exhibition created by Will Coleman and Allegra Davis to Olana, the first winter exhibition, which makes total sense since it's icebergs, in order to be able to understand how that long arc of history comes full circle here. And so we have another leg of the quest, the hunt for the icebergs to the preservation of Olana. And for anyone doubting the relevance of 19th century painting in the modern era, Chasing Icebergs, this exhibition should more than answer that concern. It follows Church's itinerary, it probes his interest in the Arctic, it brings contemporary American and Inuit artists into focus in order to understand what Church couldn't possibly have known, which is how quickly what he took for granted as an icebound northern landscape might in fact be in jeopardy. In order to speak to the continuing role of art in a time of climate crisis, this is the exhibition, this is the artist, this is the constellation that will help to make that happen. I cannot tell you how excited I am about this exhibition and about the ability to go see it. And I'd like to thank Will Coleman and Allegra Davis for putting together something that looks to be just a spectacular opportunity. So put it on your itinerary, get yourself up to Hudson, New York. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleanor, for that wonderful journey through icebergs, from sketching to rediscovery and back to Olana. We already have a few questions in the Q&A,
Okay.
so I'd like to open it up to questions. And Everyone else, please feel free to add any questions or comments for Eleanor into the Q&A, and we'll get through as many as we can. So our first question, or pair of questions, from James Gurney. In the book Close Observation, Ted Stebbins mentioned that before the trip, Church did some paintings of what he anticipated seeing on the journey. So how much did Church know about the Polar North before the trip, and how would he have researched it? And what was his actual experience like compared to that?
That's a great question. Thanks, James. Frederic Church studied before he went places. And in that respect, he really is, it's an homage to one of his distant mentors, Alexander von Humboldt, who helped Church not only see the world as an interconnected sense of ecosystems, but also really underscored the fact that in Humboldt's view, an artist did well to know everything he could about where he was planning to go in order to understand what he was seeing. And the way he framed it was that a painter needed to make, sketches in color direct on the site in order to take advantage of that immediacy. But he also really encouraged Church to double down on the research. And so in preparation for going to the Arctic, he had gotten to know Isaac Israel Hayes and Alicia Kent Kane, who were two of America's leading polar explorers. And in fact, Church will teach Hayes how to sketch and send him up on the SS United States in the winter of 1861 with that sketchbook. And this exhibition includes, I can't believe this, a number of Hayes's little watercolors that he did. Church would end up taking that data and folding it into his second big Arctic canvas, the Aurora Borealis. But if you look in Church's library, there are books on physics and optics and the properties of ice. And it makes sense that Church would have at least looked through those before he goes up to Labrador, because he knows he's going to a place that's going to look totally different, act totally different. And if he goes up unprepared, he's going to spend more time figuring out what he's looking at than he will actually have time to sketch and paint. And so for him, that preparedness is really important. But part of it is travelogues from the leading Arctic explorers. Church is also a member of the American Geographical and Statistical Society, which is a gathering of those scientifically inclined people. He's a member of the Explorers Club. And so he is spending time around people who are helping to fill his head both with the caveats of how to get up and back safely, and then what to do while you're there. One thing he figured out on the way was do not tether your small boat to an actual iceberg. That what looks stable is not, and as it bobs in the water, it will take your boat down too. And Noble will actually go through that story and kind of explain how close they came to a rather serious dunking and the loss of their rowboat. But, for every one of his trips, he ended up doing the prep work for it. And as a result, he was able, I think, to maximize what he was able to do. What I really appreciate about what you and Will did with this show, though, was actually mapping where Church went. You can read it in Noble's text, but to actually have it on a map so that it really becomes absolutely clear where he was, I think is a real gift it's a piece of it I'm really looking forward to seeing.
Yeah, mapping out the journey was really helpful for us to understand. He did truly circumnavigate the island of Newfoundland.
Yeah.
And he made it to only the southernmost tip of Labrador, knowing that all the rest of Labrador did, of course, have inhabitants, indigenous inhabitants as well as settlers, but they only made it to that southernmost tip.
Well, and it's interesting because indigeneity is a really important thing, because whether Church is in South America or whether he is in the Arctic, he has the opportunity to be around the locals, but he tends to kind of hang to himself. He observes more than he interacts. And in South America, although he was trying to teach himself Spanish, I think the language barrier was definitely something that may have contributed to that. But up in the north, I think, again, he is hewing pretty close to fishing villages that are predominantly European-centered, like Battle Harbor, where Bradford will go, rather than actually making this a trip to get to know the locals, which is what Humboldt would have done. Humboldt would have been hanging around with the Micmac and the Inuit, no question. He would have been accumulating vocabularies. It would have been a very different trip. But for Church, there is a sense of distance. And to him, where he is expending his emotional center is on the actual features in nature, not on the people. And I think that that's kind of true pretty much everywhere he goes.
Great point, absolutely. And a huge thing to consider as we look at these landscapes and what they mean then and now.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to realize that, his sense of belonging, his sense of, his encounter with these landscapes and with these natural features is going to be necessarily very different. And I think that bringing in a variety of contemporary voices and artists and doing labels in Inuit and Mi'kmaq really helps understand that this is a multicultural landscape, and this is a shared legacy, and it's a shared set of concerns. And it's not just about valorizing church, it's about using church in order to frame larger questions about what is our responsibility to each other and to this planet.
We couldn't have said it better ourselves. We have more questions pouring in, so let's move on. Next question from Rana Fight. Did the school in Manchester benefit from the sale of the painting as they'd hoped?
It was a struggle, actually. The Manchester City Council got involved and decided that the money was really theirs. There were a lot of competing entities. I mean, before the Icebergs left Manchester to even go to Sotheby's in New York, Tim Clifford, who was at that point the head of the Manchester Art Museum, which is where the painting was hanging for safekeeping, he hoped that he could lay claim to it. I mentioned that it almost never left the house for 6 or 7 years. It was actually gifted to a local church who then gave it back. And when the Icebergs sold, they're like, can we revisit that? And it was like, no. But the city of Manchester took the bulk of it. My understanding from Mayor was that although it took a while, she finally at least got enough money out of it to buy the cottage in the Lake District. But no, I don't think that the Rose Hill School for Delinquent Boys ever saw more than the minimum.
Another question about the donation logistics from Francis Shakib. Why do you think Lamar Hunt wanted his gift to be anonymous, and did he make any other anonymous art gifts that you're allowed to talk about?
No, that's actually great. I mean, I asked Lamar a lot of those same questions. And first of all, for a man who is front and center in the world of sports, whether it's professional soccer, professional football, professional baseball, professional basketball. He was a closet collector. He wasn't really interested in the limelight. He was on our board. I remember one year he was on the collections committee, and he actually had the Kansas City Chiefs playbook underneath the table that he was perusing, because he clearly had some decisions to make about, what the upcoming draft was. And so he came to the meeting, which was awfully nice, but he was clearly kind of elsewhere. He never wanted the attention turned toward him. He felt really strongly that it was the museum that needed the press, and that this was a gift to the city, and that he was simply the man who facilitated it happening. And all I can say is that, the more I got to know Norma and Lamar, the more common sense that made. They weren't looking for the limelight. They weren't looking for their name in the press. And in fact, if you asked Lamar, as I'm sure many people did, were you the one who bought the Icebergs? He would just kind of give you that enigmatic smile and change the topic. I mean, he wasn't prickly about it at all. He just was always incredibly happy that we were getting as much mileage out of the painting, and that he felt that he had done a good thing for a city that was his home.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, Susie Oppenheimer asked, I noticed that as the so-called The North premiered in New York at the beginning of the Civil War, showings of Heart of the Andes were being shuttered. Do you think there's something about this painting that is specifically intertwined with Civil War discourse in a way that Church's South American paintings weren't, or is that just happenstance and timing?
It is not happenstance. Well, of course, Church didn't know that there was going to be a civil war when he debuts this painting. It's kind of like, what do you do? Do you cancel the showing? Do you shutter it down, or do you rise to the occasion? And, when I did my Civil War exhibition, one of the leading questions that I had was, next to none of my artists are in uniform for a genre of painting, i.e. landscape, that is supposed to epitomize American democracy and patriotic values, not to mention transcendentalism. How is it that all of these artists are not painting what looks like any kind of response to the war? And what I really wanted to understand was, did these artists have a social conscience, or did they just turn their backs on the whole thing for 4 years and pretend it wasn't happening? And the realization is that there is so much nature metaphor in songs, in sermons, in abolitionist rhetoric, that what I was seeing in Martin Johnson Head's thunderstorm paintings was a literal evocation of Lincoln's statement that there is a coming storm when God will run out of patience on the issue of slavery. And then to realize those very same thunderstorm pictures are being purchased by abolitionist preachers, and that Head and Church are sitting in Henry Ward Beecher's pews at a time when Beecher is one of the leading voices. What I began to realize is that there were literary and metaphorical reasons why Church's Icebergs, Cotopaxi, Aurora Borealis, and Rainy Season in the Tropics all came at key moments during the American Civil War and seemed on a multivalent level. They're not just war pictures, but even the critics understood with Cotopaxi that it is basically about the world as we know it blowing up and coming apart at the seams. And it's Frederick Douglass who gives a lecture called The American Apocalypse, where he says slavery is America's moral volcano waiting to erupt. So there's a lot there that's kind of elliptical and metaphorical, and it isn't beating you over the head with it, but I'm happy to say that if you take a look at the first chapter in The Civil War in American Art on the metaphorical war, I tease out that argument to a fare thee well. Church retitling the painting looks, seems, and sounds slightly opportunistic, but there were cartoons in the press about the logic behind the expansion of slavery being about as viable as riding an iceberg into the tropics and expecting it not to melt. So, I mean, he is still riffing off of the imagery of the day, in addition to painting something that is the natural culmination of this 1859 trip. And I think that's the magic of his art, is it's not, none of these paintings is just one thing. The Heart of the Andes is an homage to Alexander von Humboldt's plant geography map. The Iceberg starts out as this, great disquisition on this sort of alien, destabilized landscape that turns into a patriotic gesture that flips to a doff of the hat to Arctic rescue. It's all of the above and more. And I think great works of art can stand to have multiple layers of interpretation delivered to them without sort of bowing under the weight.
Fascinating. I love that metaphor of the iceberg riding into the tropics. I'm going to think of that every time I see either of those themes in church.
I have a great political cartoon I need to send you of James Buchanan as an iceberg melting and Abraham Lincoln as the sun. It's basically about melting an iceberg in the face of abolition. So yeah, they're really interesting back and forth. And there's a really turgidly bad poem by Emerson, who is a brilliant essayist, but the poetry, it was one of his voluntaries, and he talks about how the Aurora Borealis and the stars are like the stars and stripes of the North, and that's where formerly enslaved people, that's why they go north, to achieve that freedom that is literally writ large in a polar sky. It's a little bit forced, but it was fervent, and by someone else who was also an ardent abolitionist at exactly the same time. We could go on about that for days.
Yes, lots to explore there. We have another question about the sort of ideological weight of the Arctic here from Alan Wallach. Could you explore the relationship between 19th century US imperialism, its expansionist tendencies, i.e. Manifest Destiny, and Church's motivation in traveling not only to South America, but also to the Arctic?
Alan, we only have a couple of minutes. But you and I should go out to lunch and we will dive into that. Certainly the fact that one of Church's closest friends and favorite patrons is Cyrus Field. And Field will pay for Church's 2 trips to South America. He is looking for investments as well as a missing brother. And so there definitely, that kind of imperialism is tied to that. I think for Church personally, though, he is much more interested in the Humboldtian scientific angle of it rather than the economic, mercantile, imperial angle. As far as the Arctic goes, there is no question that the myriad excuses of, we're going to the Arctic to go rescue John Franklin, who is by that time obviously dead. 60, 70 ships from, Russia, Britain, the United States, all go up into the Arctic ostensibly to go find this missing 2 sets of ships, the Terror and the Erebus. But what they're really trying to do is go furthest north, furthest west to be able to lay claim to a watery Northwest Passage, to lay claim to the Northern Arctic. And I find it fascinating that the one country that isn't sending ships up there is Canada. And they're kind of going, knock yourselves out, boys, we're putting in a railroad. I know that doesn't really answer his question, but I'm good for it, Alan. Let's get together for lunch and let's dive into that one, because that's a big, chewy topic.
All right, I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question.
Okay.
We have so many, so I'm sorry we can't get to all of you. From Lydia Rubio, the most fascinating aspect of this painting to me is the invention in landscape painting of a fantasy. And Church was, of course, an expert in doing this. You mentioned as a main factor the scale. Can you comment more on the scale and the fantastic in the painting?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the interesting things. I mean, the idea of fantastic landscapes, certainly Church inherits a good deal of that, even from Thomas Cole. He does not invent that by any stretch of the imagination. What I find fascinating about the icebergs is the way, and it's something we actually wrestled with when we did the exhibition in Dallas, which is, how do you actually rationalize the scale of the painting? And there's a school of thought, and I remember talking to Ted Stebbins about this, about, is the icebergs really the most colossal failure in Church's career? Not necessarily because of its sales history, but because he sort of wrestled with the scale in a way that was like weirdly unsatisfying. And I think that the way that I would frame it is this. When Church went up there, and to circle around to the very first question about, did Church paint Arctic related scenery before he got there? We have no way of knowing if that first little oil sketch that I showed you with the boat on top of the ice that has kind of the lurid sunset, we don't really know if that predates or postdates the trip to Labrador. That could very easily be a kind of, maybe I'll do something like this when I get back, kind of a way of fixing it in his head based on a lot of those engravings. Because again, huge number of engravings for 50 years now of Arctic ships stranded in the ice. This is not a new trope. And I think that may be one of the reasons Church ended up abandoning it, is it had been done by others, and Church doesn't really like just mimicking other people. But I think, realistically, it's such an alien landscape. How do you try to convey that to a public that's never been there? And, it's a little bit like looking at clouds, and we all look and go, that's a horse. No, that's a train. And there's this Rorschach piece of it, that if you look at icebergs, there's also a tendency to see palaces and castles and weird architectural features. You get ice fog, which will end up creating really bizarre shadows, which can be very disorienting spatially. They're perihelions, they're ice bows. We don't know how much of that Church would have seen in the middle of the summer, but I think that it's an alien enough landscape that even though he goes up there having done the rational scientific thing and done his homework, he clearly comes back needing to blend the fantastical with the realistic in order to give you a sense of the sensibility of what it's like to look at this. So it's the interesting thing about the Carnegie picture, where you've got the ship sort of silhouetted against the one large iceberg. That's probably the most realistic thing that he did based on the Arctic. But he starts out with this, I think, sort of semi-emotional response to the landscape that he's just been in. And again, I wonder in my own mind if stabilizing the foreground of the icebergs is a nod to his queasy stomach. He never paints storm-tossed boats, and it's just no. But I do find it interesting that by the time he starts actually mapping the contours of the finished painting, it is a combination of direct observation and clear invention. And we talk about Church being the Humboldtian artist, the idea that he's going to always be after accuracy, and I think no, he's after power. He's after taking what he has seen and delivering it back to you in as powerful a way as he knows how.
I would put in another plug for our new edition of After Icebergs with a Painter by Louis Le Grand Noble, for that insight on the experience of seeing this alien landscape in person. And then it's very interesting to then compare Noble's descriptions to what Church turned out with.
Yeah, and actually, it is interesting because Noble's somewhat purple prose is actually backed up by a lot of the things that Church will end up sketching. That sense of anticipation, the sense of the drama, the sense of, sort of having to rationalize this almost Samuel Taylor Coleridgean kind of world that they've landed in. And I wonder if either man really understood how deeply different it was going to end up being. And my guess is they didn't. And each one, Noble in prose and Church in paint, had to figure out a way to kind of make good on, how do you actually convey that kind of otherworldliness and still ground it in reality? And so, the fact that Church flips the scale on the painting by, substituting the spar of a mast rather than the full ship, it's almost like once you see it, you can't unsee it, that if you actually extrapolate the rest of the ship, the rest of the icebergs, the whole topography seems to shrink rather dramatically. And I think it's to Church's credit that that's not the first thing that first, second, or third thing that you notice.
All right, well, we're a little past our time. So we appreciate so much all these fantastic insights, Eleanor, and thank you all for your very good questions. We'll follow up with more information about the After Icebergs book, about Eleanor's book, everything she referenced in the talk, and about the exhibition at Olana, which we hope you will all find a chance to see, open until the end of March. So thank you all very much again, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.
And thank you, Allegra. This has been wonderful. And thanks to everyone at Olana for pulling this off. Again, it's a massive undertaking, and I am delighted that it's all come together, and I can't wait to see it.
Thank you, Eleanor.